What's up, security world? It feels like it's been years since I've seen you guys, and I have really missed you. Well, I've been busy creating a few new products that we'll talk about at a later date. But during my time off, I've been thinking about all the things that I want to talk about with you. The first of which is the lack of good information that we get in the security industry. As such, I found a real expert in the security guard industry to share some of his insights. This is going to be a hot video. Do people still say hot, or have I gone and gotten old? What are you young guys saying, if not hot?
Free, we say banger.
What, banger? Banger? Okay. This is going to be a banger video. What?
Free, no, not banger video. Just banger.
Just banger. Okay. Sorry, I've been corrected. This is going to be a banger. Hey, Keith, it's good to be on the line with you. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Great seeing you, Courtney. So my name is Keith Oranger. I'm the president of Security Pro Advisors. I represent sellers in the security space, whether it's security guarding, security integration, or anything in the security verticals. So I do brokerage, I do merger acquisition work, representing sellers. I do valuations of companies, and I do advisory consulting.
Okay, so is that just for small companies or big companies? I mean, what's the typical company that you work with? What's that look like?
Typical company, I would say the revenue, I would go as low as $1.5 million, no lower than that, 2 million, somewhere in there, all the way up to a couple $100 million. So primarily our business has been in North America, but I'm getting more calls globally now.
So you've seen the whole gamut of companies, from the small guys to the big guys, right? So in your opinion, what's the difference between the two? I mean, is there really a difference?
Yes, there's a difference with the small. I would put it, Courtney, into 4 buckets: small, regional, national, global. And the small guy, let's break it into people, processes, technology, and capital. Okay, so the small, let's talk about security guard companies. The small security guard company, from a technology point, might be on QuickBooks and do a lot of manual processes. And so their strength, they have to have really good client retention and stay really close to the customer and offer that boutique service. When you get to the regional player, they're getting more sophisticated in technology. They have more access to capital. Their processes, when I talk about processes, I'm talking about background screening, training, compliance. As the companies get bigger, you see technology, processes, and access to capital get better and more sophisticated. So, the small company, we're always talking about technology to compete against the larger companies. They really need to get with the program and stay very on top of technology. Technology not only helps you, just staying with your competition, but just to manage your business, whether it's overtime, turnover, etc. You want those metrics to measure the company so you could manage that company, whether it's a small, regional, national, global. The global companies, as you know, the Securitases, the ProSecures, the Guarders, the Allied Universals, those companies, we talk about those 4 things. They have really good processes. Technology is very sophisticated, a lot of access to capital. And when I talk about people, whether you're a small, regional, national, or global company, you want to surround yourself with good people. Even if you're a small business owner, you can't do everything yourself. So you need to surround yourself with a good operations manager a good business development person. So you're as good as the people around you. And we talk about security, you're as good as the front line of people at the site, right? It all starts with the site. If you don't treat your employees well, who are your security officers, who's the bread and butter of the business, what do you have? So it's really that message from the top on down. But getting back to your question, it's really people, processes, technology, access to capital. That's really important. And again, with the small company, because they don't have the capital and they're not as sophisticated, that customer client relationship is really important. They want to keep their client retention in the mid 90s and offer that boutique service and try to separate themselves from those large national companies, which might not, some customers want to talk to the owner per se. They want to feel they could get someone at the highest level.
And I want to circle back to that, but you mentioned something that, kind of intrigued me a little bit. So you said that you're working on a deal that's outside kind of North America in terms, I guess it's an acquisition.
Yes, I would be representing the seller.
So are we done with these acquisitions? I mean, the acquisition phase in the security industry, or do you see that continuing on? Because it seems like, all the big guys are all gone now. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, I could tell you that I'll just give you a quick history. The security space has been always fragmented, going back to the late 70s. There were many small companies, regional. We didn't have huge companies now like in the US. But what happens is the market's very fragmented. We see a wave of consolidation all the time. In the early 80s, we saw Borg Warner, which was Wells Fargo Burns. We saw Pinkerton. We saw Securitas enter the US market in the late 90s, buying Pinkerton and Burns. We saw Allied Barton, US Security in the early 2000s, buying companies. Then we saw Universal, which is now Allied Universal, buying companies. We're seeing Garda. What happens is companies are bought up. These companies have grown. However, there are new companies popping up all the time. That's the nice thing about this. Even though we're seeing consolidations in every decade, the amount of companies popping up or continually popping up because there's more outsourcing of security services. You see in some of the larger transactions, management who is with companies start their own companies. Okay, you see people come in out of law enforcement starting their own companies. So security is growing. There's more outsourcing of services, whether it's the governmental sector outsourcing, the police are outsourcing that private security police relationship. So this is not going away. The security market is constantly evolving. So you might have seen a company 10 years ago who was $2 million, and today they could be 15 million. So we're seeing companies, I put out with Bob McCree's security letter, and that listing, if you go back to the mid 90s and now, the names have changed and they're completely new companies. There are a few companies that are still out there, but it's changed dramatically. So you mentioned, you've had other people coming into the industry, starting companies, big execs with, a portfolio might choose to shoot off and start their own company. What advice would you give to someone, maybe it's the guy who's just retired from the police force, or the guy who just had a company acquired and he's moving off to start his own company? What advice would you give them? Because running a security guard company is unlike anything that I have ever done before, right? So what advice would you give to someone who's just getting started? Well, I think it's important, first of all, if you're starting a company, you're going to need a sales pipeline. So you're going to want relationships that you could go to get their business. That's number one. So whether it's you or if you're hiring someone, you need a good business development manager. Without sales, there's no company here unless you make an acquisition. That's number one. Number two, again, the people you surround yourself with. You need besides a good business development person, you need a good operations person who could service your clients and schedule the security officers and train them, etc. That's important. Technology. You're going to want a guard tour tracking system. You want a good payroll billing system. You want an HR system. Technology is really important. You're going to want working capital, line of credit with the bank. Let's say you get $1 million job and you need the funds to pay the payroll. If the payroll is weekly or biweekly or every other week, you really need that working capital to fund the payroll and continue operations. So capital is really important. So we talked about technology, sales, also, as I said, processes are important. You want to make sure you're in compliance with state licensing. You want to make sure that your background screening is good, your training, your uniforming process. All that is important, keeping your personnel files. So the way you organize the company is really important also.
Okay, so those would be the things that you would advise companies to do. What would you say are the three biggest mistakes that you've seen companies commit, in your time in the industry?
The biggest mistakes I've seen are owners who are just interested in looking at the top line revenue. They could take on customers, number one, that are not profitable, customers that might not pay them. They'll drag, their receivables. They might pay you 90 days out where you're funding the payroll. I've seen people go into weak vertical markets. With COVID-19, we've learned that certain vertical markets been hurt, and COVID-19 retail's been hurt. So if you're in stores and malls, you've seen aviation be hurt. You've seen hotels. You've seen stadium work be hurt. You've seen schools be hurt. So my point is, when you build a company, you want to target certain vertical markets where you think the economy is going to grow, where you think there's going to be upside. You don't want to go into vertical markets where there's no growth. So that's number one. You want to look at liability also. Do you want to go into high crime areas where there could be more liability? Unarmed work is preferred versus armed just because of liability issues. You have to look at workman's comp, general liability. Also, the other mistake I've seen, people focus on, they don't pay attention to their accounts receivable as much as they should, especially in COVID-19. I've heard people call me and said, well, we got all this work and, our sales are up, but, we've gotten a lot of temp work here. And if you don't get the money in advance, especially if it's a customer that's not your current customer, you could be providing the service and not getting paid. So getting back to your point, vertical markets are important. Don't just look at the top line, manage your costs. It's very important to manage your costs. Pay attention to your receivables. That's all important. Without cash flow, you have a problem. And also client retention. Okay. You could, if you're in the mode that, hey, I lost 3, but I sold 4, that's not the way to approach it. You want to keep your client retention in the mid 90s because you know how hard it is to get a new account. Courtney, you had your own company with your dad. You've seen it. So you've lived it. And getting new sales are very difficult. So you want to hold on to your current customers. It's really, really important. And also, one other mistake I've seen, Courtney, is I've seen some managers where they focus on profit percentage. So you could have a branch or a company that's at 10%, but they're only their sales are flat. But you might have another company where the profit percentage is 7%, but the sales are growing 5 to 10% a year. I much rather have the 5 to 10% organic growth, because at the end of the day, the value of your company is not the profit percentage.
Got it. Got it. So let me circle back. You brought up something that I get asked all the time. You know, to your point, I was in that same position with accounts receivables. You know, we're growing, but nobody's paying their bills. We're profitable on our P&L, but you know, we're struggling with payroll. You know, that's a hard thing for companies to deal with if you don't have the cash flow, if you don't have the line of credit at the bank. So I get a lot of companies that ask me, can they pre-bill their customers? I mean, what's your take on that? Do certain companies, you know, are you able to accomplish that, or what's your thought on that?
I would say the majority of the companies don't like advanced billing.
Mhm.
Or another way to look at it is a fixed bill, where they give you a fixed amount monthly and then there's a reconciliation at the end of the month. I think, especially in these economic times, your clients are, they're holding on to their cash also. So I think if you're starting a new company, let's say you're just starting out and you want to build your company, obviously you want customers who are going to pay you in advance. What I would say, Courtney, a good way to track them to pay earlier is maybe giving them a discount, like a 1% discount or a 2% discount on the bill if they pay within 10 days. That'll improve your cash flow. It might hurt your margin a little, but in the end, if you could get your cash in quicker, it would probably be beneficial.
Okay, thanks for answering that. So let's circle back. I'm sorry, one more time. You start talking about profit dollars, right? So that's one of the important things, that owners should be looking at, I guess, if they want to be acquired. What other things should companies be looking for? Let's say I'm a security guard company owner. I've been in business for 30 years and I'm ready to exit. How should I go about preparing my company for that?
Well, I would say there are three key items. You want to get your financial statements in order, make sure your financial statements are accurate. Number two, you want to hire, if you're looking to sell your company, an expert who specializes in the security space, whether it's guarding, etc., that has done deals, and also someone who's worked in the industry. That's important. And if someone has like a CPA qualification, that's important. Also, someone who knows both sides, not only lived and worked the business, but also knows the financial component. So rather than a generalized broker who might be selling, retail stores, et cetera, or different, it's better to have a specialist who really knows your industry. And number three, you want to make sure all your client relationships are solid. We talk about financial statements, but you want to make sure client relationships are solid, your contracts are solid, and you want to make sure you're in compliance with licensing, etc. It's important, when companies are acquiring you, what are they acquiring? The operating assets. Usually, if it's an asset deal, they're buying customer contracts. That's the key here, is making sure those relationships are solid. And if your contracts are up for bid or there's a renewal period, make sure you lock them in.
Okay. So I've talked to a couple of companies, owners who, have exited in the past couple of years. And I've talked to companies who, are thinking about it. One of the other things, interesting things that I've had conversations about are some companies are looking at the idea of franchising their companies. Have you heard of that? Do you think it's a good idea, bad idea? What's your take?
Yes, very interesting. That idea has been tried, numerous times over the years. I think for a franchisee, someone coming out of, say, military law enforcement, who might have more comfort with the structure and a back office, franchising could be good. I think in the security industry, I would say in general, it hasn't worked out well for people trying that. Signal 88, it's worked out well. They've done a decent job franchising. But overall in industry, that's probably the only franchise that comes to mind. I've seen other people try it and failed. And I think, because with franchising, whoever buys that franchise, they're paying a fee to the franchisor. So, the margins in the security space are tight. So you have to weigh that. But as I said, for certain people, it might be good if they're looking for a lot of structure and have the back office support. So it really depends. But in general, this industry has not been an industry where a lot of franchising has occurred.
So you would definitely advise against that, then, it sounds like.
I'm not, it really depends on the individual. If you're asking me if I were starting my own business and I surrounded myself with some experts, to advise me, I would probably go the route non-franchise, just because I think, one of the big advantages not going franchise, you don't have to pay a fee to anyone. That money stays in your pocket. So I would say, in general, yes, you're correct. If I were advising them, if they could, even if they don't feel comfortable with structure, get some experts, get the right technology, if you consult with an HR person or an attorney or an accountant or someone, an advisor consultant, who specializes in the security space, you could consult with them and they could help you set up the company and structure it and go that route, and then not have to pay any franchise fees.
So speaking of, advice, if someone wants you to help them out with their business, right? Help them grow it, sell it. I mean, is that something that your company does? How do you help your customers?
Yes. Again, my bread and butter is the merger acquisition business where I represent sellers. I do valuations of companies. However, I've had many companies who are not ready to sell who've come to me and asked me for advisory consulting services where I provide strategic advice and how to get their value of their company up. And I point them in the direction. And Courtney, there are really 7 items that I would advise to look at, and just to simplify this.
Okay.
Sales, and I'll go into them. Sales, 1, profitability, 2, client retention, 3, cash flow, 4, workman's comp and general liability insurance, 5, technology, 6, and work and line of credit, access to good banking relationships, 7. And the order I went, that's not any order, it's just those 7 items. But quickly to touch upon it, sales, without sales, you die, you can't grow. Client retention, you want to keep, as I said before, in the mid 90s. That's really important. Cash flow, you want to keep your receivables, 30 days or less if possible. The industry average, I would say, is 30 to 45. The workman's comp, general liability, you want to have a good insurance broker. You want to keep your rates down. You want to have programs and take on accounts that are good for insurance purposes. That's why it's important when we talk about vertical markets, what type of verticals you're going into. A shopping mall might be more of an insurance risk than, a distribution center. So it really varies. Technology, we talked about, you want a guard tour tracking system. You want a good payroll billing system. If you're on manual processes, it's going to be harder to keep up with your competition. You have to stay, technology is constantly changing. You got to stay on the cutting edge. You need banking relationships. If you want to expand the company, you want that line of credit. Very important to have a good banker, because if your company is growing and you don't have that access to capital, it's hard to grow. It's just very difficult. And as we talked about, profitability is important. You want to manage your cost structure, whether it's your direct labor, whether it's your unbilled overtime, your training, your direct costs, uniform costs. You want to manage that gross margin. That's really important. And then you want to manage the fixed cost under your gross margin, whether it's your salaries for your corporate office or your branch, your rent, anything that's a fixed cost you want to manage. Because if you're not paying attention to that, your cost structure could get out of whack. And I've seen some companies overexpand too quickly, or they're not running as lean as they can. I think there's a fine line between keeping your costs down and servicing your client. You could go two different extremes. You could have too many people, but you could have too little people where you cut to the bone and then you can't service your clients. To me, you want to, if anything, give that extra client service, because if you're losing customers, word gets back in this industry. References are critical.
Keith, you are like a fountain of knowledge. Okay. If there are other companies, security companies out there who are thinking about exiting or want to reach out to you, how do they contact you?
The best way, they go to my website, www.securityproadvisors.com. So they could reach out to me that way. And I've published numerous articles for Security Magazine. I have my own magazine that I've put out. So if you type in my name, Google it, or you'll find it, or put Security Pro Advisors in Google, and you'll pop up and see everything.
Again, Keith, thank you so much for spending some time with me this afternoon and offering up all this valuable information. I know people will absolutely love it. Again, thanks again, and stay safe out here.
Thanks, Courtney. You too, my friend. Be well. Take care.